Preston Kane's fingers were resting on the cold steel handle of his own private jet, 30 seconds from a flight that was supposed to end in a boardroom victory, not a headline. Behind him, cutting through the hum of idling engines, a voice he did not recognize said 4 words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Don't you dare enter that plane."
Don't you dare enter that plane!
Six hours earlier, nobody in Preston Kane's world would have believed that this man, invisible to almost everyone who passed him on the street, held the only warning that could save a billionaire's life. Nobody would have believed he had any right to speak to a man like Kane at all, let alone stop him cold with a single sentence. But by the end of that night, the name on every news channel in the country would not belong to the billionaire. By the end of this story, you will understand why the most dangerous person standing on that tarmac that night was not the one anyone expected to be armed. His name was Terrell Boone, and 4 years of being overlooked had taught him exactly how to notice everything everyone else missed. 22 years earlier, he had worn a different uniform, one that trained him to read machinery the way other men read faces. Tonight, that same instinct, the one that had kept soldiers alive on foreign runways, was about to save a stranger's life on American soil, and it was about to cost him more than he had ever imagined he still had left to lose. He did not know yet who wanted Preston Kane gone, or why, or how close he himself would come to disappearing before the truth ever surfaced. All he knew, standing on that tarmac with his heart pounding and his hands shaking, was that something about that plane was wrong, and that for the first time in 4 years, he had a reason to stop making himself invisible. Stay with me, because the man who was about to lose everything to save a stranger had no idea yet that a stranger was about to save him right back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 2 men stood on that runway that night, and neither of them would ever be the same again. One had nothing left to lose. The other believed, right up until that moment, that he had everything under control. Terrell Boone had spent 4 years learning how to disappear, and Preston Kane had spent his entire life learning how to be seen. And somehow, it was the man nobody noticed who ended up holding the one piece of information that could save the man everybody watched. How did a homeless man standing at the edge of a private airfield know, before anyone else on that tarmac, that something about Preston Kane's jet was wrong? He had no badge, no clearance, no reason to be within 100 feet of that hangar. And yet he had seen something in the way those maintenance crews moved that made his stomach turn cold. Somewhere inside Preston Kane's own company was a person who wanted him dead, someone close enough to know his travel schedule, his security routines, even which mechanics would be on duty that night. And Terrell Boone had no idea yet just how close to home that betrayal would turn out to be. What almost nobody watching the news the next morning would ask, and what mattered more than anything else, was what it had cost Terrell to open his mouth at all. Speaking up meant stepping into the one kind of spotlight a man in his position could never afford, the kind that invites questions about who you are, where you came from, and why you were close enough to see what you saw. Tucked inside his coat that night were the only 2 things Terrell Boone had carried with him through every shelter, every cold doorway, and every year since he lost almost everything. A set of army dog tags worn smooth from 4 years of being touched for comfort, and a torn boarding pass from a flight he had taken a long time ago, back when his name still meant something to people who mattered. Terrell Boone had spent 22 years in the Army, most of them in logistics, making sure aircraft moved on schedule and nothing went wrong on the ground before a plane ever left it. He could read a maintenance checklist the way most people read a stop sign, instantly, without thinking, and he could tell within seconds when a routine that was supposed to look ordinary did not. That instinct did not disappear when he left the service. It followed him into a civilian contract job years later, the kind of steady work that was supposed to carry him into retirement, until an injury on that job changed everything. His claim for workers' compensation was denied, then denied again on appeal, and within a year the man who had once kept million-dollar aircraft running on time could not keep a roof over his own head. He moved through the shelter system for a while, then out of it, taking whatever cleanup work he could find near the edges of airfields, places that still felt, in some small way, like they belonged to him. Preston Kane had built his company from almost nothing, and by the night his jet sat waiting on that tarmac, he had learned to trust almost no one who worked for him, a habit that had kept him alive in business for 20 years and was about to matter in a way he never expected. His closest partner, a co-founder named Daniel Reyes, had spent months quietly lining up a boardroom vote that would push Kane out of the company he built, and this trip, the one Kane was 30 seconds from boarding, was supposed to be the trip where that vote finally happened. Kane suspected disloyalty. He did not yet suspect anything worse. For 6 weeks, Terrell Boone had been doing cleanup work near the private hangar where Preston Kane's jet was kept, long enough to memorize the rhythm of the maintenance crews without ever meaning to. The shift changes, the order they walked the tarmac, the sound their equipment made when everything was normal. That night, the pattern was wrong. He had spent 22 years learning to read machines, and standing in the dark at the edge of that hangar, he realized he was about to read something else entirely, a lie, dressed up to look exactly like routine maintenance. From the shadow of a fuel drum near the edge of the hangar, Terrell Boone watched 2 men in maintenance uniforms move around Preston Kane's jet at an hour when no scheduled maintenance was supposed to happen at all. Their badges caught the light the same way every legitimate badge did, but the numbers stitched into their jackets did not match any crew rotation he had memorized over 6 weeks of watching that hangar. Then he saw it. One of them knelt beneath the fuselage and disconnected a hydraulic line in a way that no standard procedure Terrell had ever known in 22 years of Army logistics would call for. It was not a repair. It was a setup designed to fail once that plane was already in the air, far from any runway where it could land safely again. He tried to do the right thing first. He found the nearest airfield security guard and told him exactly what he had seen. The mismatched badges, the hydraulic line, all of it. The guard looked him up and down, saw a man in a coat 2 sizes too large, and waved him off without so much as walking toward the hangar to check. Somewhere on the access road, Preston Kane's car was already 20 minutes out and closing, and every minute that passed without anyone listening to him felt heavier than the last. Terrell made a decision that went against everything he had trained himself to do for 4 straight years, staying small, staying unnoticed, staying out of anyone's way who might have him removed or arrested for standing where a homeless man was never supposed to stand. He walked toward the private hangar himself, past a chain-link fence that was never meant to let someone like him through, because the alternative was watching a man die and living with the knowledge that he had known and said nothing. Preston Kane's car pulled up, and he stepped out already moving toward the jet stairway, his mind still on the boardroom vote waiting for him at his destination. His hand had barely touched the cold steel handle of the door when a voice cut across the tarmac, rough and certain, impossible to mistake for anyone with the authority to be there. "Don't you dare enter that plane." Security moved immediately, closing in on Terrell Boone from 2 directions at once, ready to drag him off the tarmac before he could say another word. In the next 10 seconds, Preston Kane would make a decision that either saved his own life or ended a stranger's. Preston Kane raised a hand before his security team could reach Terrell Boone, and in that single gesture he made a choice that would define everything that followed. He told them to stand down, and instead of walking up the stairs into his jet, he walked toward the stranger who had just stopped him cold with 4 words. What Terrell told him in the next few minutes was enough to send Kane's own engineers crawling beneath the aircraft with flashlights instead of boarding passes. The inspection confirmed everything. The hydraulic line Terrell had watched being disconnected would have failed at exactly the altitude where recovery was impossible, turning a routine flight into a catastrophe with no survivors. By morning, the story was everywhere. Every news outlet in the country ran some version of the same headline: "A billionaire saved by a homeless man." And for a few days it seemed like the kind of story people needed to believe was still possible in the world. But underneath the celebration, questions kept surfacing that nobody could quite answer yet. Reporters chased a disgruntled former mechanic who had been let go from Kane's company months earlier. Others pointed toward a rival logistics firm that had been trying to poach Kane's biggest client for over a year. Neither lead went anywhere, and the real question, the one that mattered most, stayed open. Then the attention turned, as it often does, from gratitude to suspicion, and this time the target was Terrell Boone himself. How exactly had a homeless man known precisely what to look for on a private jet's hydraulic system, in the dark, from a distance, well enough to describe it accurately to trained engineers within minutes? Reporters who had called him a hero 3 days earlier began asking pointed questions about his army discharge, his years on the street, whether a man like him could really have stumbled onto something this specific by accident. Nobody was interested yet in his answer. They were only interested in whether he was hiding one. The break came from somewhere nobody expected, buried in the airfield's own security logs. Every badge used to access that hangar that night was tracked automatically, time-stamped and recorded, and when investigators finally pulled the data, one name stood out among the maintenance crew's credentials, a name that had nothing to do with any outside mechanic or rival firm at all. The badge belonged to someone Preston Kane had trusted for 11 years. The name investigators found in that badge log belonged to Daniel Reyes, the man who had built the company alongside Preston Kane from the very beginning, the man Kane had trusted with everything for 11 years. The boardroom vote had never been the whole plan. Reyes had spent the better part of 2 years quietly moving company funds into accounts that existed only on paper, and Kane's next shareholder report, the one scheduled for release the week after this trip, would have exposed every dollar of it. Losing a vote would have cost Reyes his position. Losing that report would have cost him his freedom. Killing Preston Kane before either of those things happened solved both problems at once, and it very nearly worked. When Kane sat across from Reyes for the last time, it was not in a boardroom, but in a room with investigators present, watching a man he had trusted since the earliest days of his company admit, piece by piece, to a plan that would have ended his life for the sake of protecting money that was never his to take. Kane said little. There was nothing left to negotiate, and no version of an apology that could undo what Reyes had set in motion. Reyes was arrested that same afternoon, and as he was let out in handcuffs, Kane found himself thinking not about the 11 years of partnership he had just lost, but about the stranger with nothing left to lose who had risked everything he had to save a man who had never once thanked him by name. In the days that followed, the story shifted one final time, and this time it stayed shifted. The same reporters who had questioned Terrell Boone's motives now told a very different story, one about a man who had spent 4 years being overlooked and had used the one skill nobody could take from him to save a stranger's life at real personal risk. Public opinion, once suspicious, turned fully and completely in his favor, and for the first time since he had left the army, people were finally asking Terrell Boone the right question. Not why was he there, but who he really was. Preston Kane could have written Terrell Boone a check large enough to end the conversation and let the world move on to the next headline. And for a while people assumed that was exactly what he would do. Instead, he offered Terrell something he had not been given in 4 years, a job built around the exact skills that had saved his life on that tarmac. Working within the company's ground operations security division, reading equipment and procedures the same way he had read them for 22 years in the army. It was not a gift. It was a recognition that the man everyone had walked past for 4 years had never stopped being capable of exactly this kind of work. Then came the part of the story nobody had expected when it began. Years earlier, Terrell's claim for workers' compensation after his injury had been denied, then denied again, a decision that had quietly set his entire life on the path that led him to that hangar in the first place. Once his case became public, once reporters and lawyers alike began asking how a man with his record had ended up homeless at all, that old claim was reopened. This time it was reversed. The loop that had started years before Preston Kane ever knew his name finally closed. Preston Kane had spent years surrounded by people paid to protect him, security teams, executives, a partner he trusted more than anyone else in his company, and in the end none of them had seen what was coming. It took a man paid nothing at all to actually save him. Would you have believed him? What do you think you would have done in Terrell Boone's position, standing on that tarmac with nothing left to lose, watching something no one else could see? Would you have spoken up and risked everything, the way he did, or would you have stayed invisible and stayed safe, the way 4 years of hard lessons had taught him to? Terrell chose to speak, and it cost him almost everything he had left before it gave him back more than he ever expected. Not every story ends that way. If you want to know what happens when someone in that same impossible position chooses differently, stay close, because that story is coming next. If stories like this hit different, subscribe. We've got more real-life twists coming.